I'm here with Professor Noam Chomsky, historian, political activist, considered to be the founder of modern linguistics and one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world. Professor Chomsky, thank you for your time.
Very glad to be with you.
Professor Chomsky, it was only several months ago that you predicted that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan would cause the collapse of the Afghan army and the government. And that's exactly what's happened. That's what's unfolded in the last few weeks, as we've seen. And yet we see the Biden administrations and others express surprise at what's happened, or at least at the speed at which it's all happened. What are your thoughts on that?
The basic problem is one that is familiar in other circumstances, Vietnam, Iraq. The executive branch of the government, the top of the government, is burdened by intelligence information, which is rarely accurate. The people on the ground know what's happening, but as the information filters up to the top, it gets modified, adapted to what people want to hear, and they literally don't know what's happening. We saw that over and over again. If you were not burdened by intelligence and you were just looking at the facts, it was pretty plain what was going to happen. I don't say that in retrospect. You can look back at things I was writing months ago. The government was a morass of corruption, which had virtually no support. The army was largely on paper. About half of it probably wasn't even there, ghost soldiers. Others were trained on the American military model, where you rely on very heavy air power, mechanized support to try to keep soldiers from really entering directly into combat. You're not going to win a guerrilla war that way. Go back to Vietnam. Take the Tet Offensive in January 1968. The most astonishing uprising that's ever happened in military history. The US had almost 600,000 troops in South Vietnam. There was a South Vietnamese army of 700,000, very well armed, trained by the US. They were in every village. Nobody had one word about the fact that a huge popular uprising took place all over the country, completely surprising everyone. The US had to turn to massive bombardment to try to put it down. A couple of weeks before that, the generals were telling Washington, we've won the war, it's all over, we can start pulling out troops. Okay, we know the mechanisms by which that happens. Same happened when, take Iraq, the Iraqi army that the US had created had about 350,000 well-armed soldiers, according to the statistics. 800 jihadis, 800 coming in pickup trucks, waving rifles. They disappeared. Okay. It's, it happens over and over and you never learn from it.
There are some small pockets of resistance left, such as in the Panjshir area, where the Andrab area, and they have openly, publicly asked for support. They've said, give us, in particular, military support. Would it be wise for the US or others to extend a hand to them, or should the policy be, as Joe Biden has suggested, which is to leave Afghan internal business and possibly civil war to Afghans?
whatever the policy should be, it should be determined by Afghans. They are the ones who are going to live with the situation. It's their responsibility. They should be brought actively into the arrangements. They are the ones who have to be in the lead in determining policy. That never crossed anyone's mind. I mean, it wasn't even an option to be considered. The only option is, how do we do this in the best way for us? You know, okay, that's going to be a disaster. By now, even by now, take the policy of withholding funds from the Taliban. Who does that hurt the Taliban leadership? They can get the funds from opium sales to Europe. Europe buys the opium, which funds the heroin, which funds the Taliban. It'll hurt the population, just as the bombing, the drone attack yesterday hurt the population. If the World Bank and the IMF withhold funds, same thing. It's the same as sanctions. Who do sanctions hurt? Suppose you put sanctions on Iran, devastating for the population. Does it hurt the leadership? No. The sanctions on Saddam Hussein, extreme sanctions, devastated the population. The administrators of the sanctions, distinguished international diplomats, Dennis Halliday, Hans von Sponeck, they both resigned in protest, one after the other, because the sanctions, they said, were genocidal. Did they hurt Saddam Hussein? They benefited him. The population had to shelter under his wings for survival. He had some rationing systems. It's the same over and over. The idea in powerful states is, we have force, we monopolize violence, we'll use it. That's what we can do. We can use our force. What happens to the victims? Not our business. That was true of the invasion of Afghanistan in the first place. 20 years ago, the US invaded, not knowing who was responsible for 9/11. The people who are at the wrong end of the bombs, they often know what's happening. So right away, the most respected of the anti-Taliban resistance in Afghanistan, Abdul Haq, had an interview, which he was asked, of course, asked about the invasion. He was bitterly opposed. He said, the invasion will just kill a lot of Afghans. It'll undermine our efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within. The United States is doing it because they want to show their muscle and want to intimidate everyone. It's pretty accurate. Now that we are getting, finally, 20 years late, a leakage of the internal records from Donald Rumsfeld, others, we see that's pretty much true. Now it's conceded that in 20 years ago, the Taliban offered to surrender. And Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, said, we don't negotiate surrenders. We're going to destroy you, okay? We're not going to let you live in dignity somewhere, even though we don't know that you were responsible for 9/11. Exactly what Abdul Haq said. You want to show your muscle and intimidate everyone, okay? It's true then. It wasn't as clear then as it is now, but it was pretty clear. I was writing pretty much that at the time, as were others. But in a powerful state, you don't listen. In a well-controlled intellectual community, deeply indoctrinated, following orders, you don't ask the questions. It happens over and over. And nothing is learned from it for a good reason. Not because people are stupid, but that's the way the institutions are structured. You move into those institutions, that's the way you behave. So 2 days, I mean, by now the evidence is simply overwhelming that the American strategy of bombing villages or sending in special forces to break open people's doors in the middle of the night and arrest somebody, all of this was just creating Taliban. It's very well known. So what's the first reaction of the military when there's a terrorist attack? Do the same thing. Today, we get the news, which you could have anticipated. Family of 10 people killed, 7 children, an infant. Consequences. Doesn't take much imagination, especially when it's been happening over and over for 20 years.
So there is a worry that with Taliban taking over the country, forming a new government, hasn't been formed yet, but that's what the prediction is, that Afghanistan will become a safe haven for the likes of Al-Qaeda, Daesh. What are your thoughts on whether, on people who say that Afghanistan will become a safe haven for these terrorists? What would that mean for Afghanistan, for the region, and for the world, if that indeed?
Well, first of all, why should we assume that Afghanistan will become a haven for terrorists? Actually, it's the United States which is creating the terrorist networks, not by funding them, but by its actions. What has happened? Let's go back to 2001. Al-Qaeda and bin Laden were in a tiny area at the border of the Afghan-Pakistan border, AFPAC. That's where it's the seat of Islamic terrorism. Where is it now? All over the world. We've given bin Laden the greatest gift he could have imagined. 9/11 was the most successful action in military history. The United States reacted exactly the way he wanted, by showing our muscle, using force, spreading radical Islam all over the world. We accelerated it further when we invaded Iraq, created the Sunni resistance, ISIS finally, spreading all over Africa, Philippines, all over the place. Now let's go back to your question. The Taliban have every reason to keep radical Islamic terrorists out of the country. In 2001, they did keep bin Laden there as part of the tribal culture. The tribal culture is, yes, you give people protection. And it's a tribal society. They live by the deep-seated tribal culture. There are specialists on tribal societies, especially Afghanistan and Pakistan. People like Akbar Ahmed, highly respected anthropologist, has been trying for 20 years to get somebody to listen to this. Wonderful book about it called The Throne of the Thistle. He's well respected. He's in all the major institutes, and people, they can't hear it. So the Taliban kept bin Laden there as part of the tribal culture. They didn't want him around. He was a nuisance. They didn't want the US attacking. In fact, they had pretty good relations with the US in the 1990s. They were working on pipeline arrangements and so on. But they couldn't just kick him out. Well, when 9/11 happened, they did begin to make offers to allow him to be moved out of the country somehow, maybe sent to an Islamic state for trial or something, or maybe just to totally surrender if the Taliban leadership could live in dignity. Absolutely not. We have to show our muscle, intimidate everyone, show that we are the boss, we have force, We don't negotiate surrender. We're just going to use our force to smash everything up and make the world look the way we want it to be. Okay. Imperial power.
Trillions of dollars spent in Afghanistan. Most of that went to military, but there was some money spent in programs that were supposed to provide Afghans with the tools needed to build their country. Education programs, cultural programs. Now we're seeing, we've just seen over 100,000 Afghans evacuated out of the country. The UN Refugee Agency just a couple of days ago predicted that there could be possibly 500,000 Afghans leaving Afghanistan in the next few months. Many of the people who are leaving the country are the scholars, intellectuals, the young professionals, the artists. These are the very people that were the hopes of the country, the people that were supposed to build it. So with these people gone, the investment gone, who's going to build the country? Is it effectively going back to zero, to start from scratch? Who's going to help Taliban build it?
Well, there are a few things to say about that. First of all, the chances that they'll leave are not very high because the Europeans and the Americans are too sadistic to allow them to enter. You can see it right now, okay? They may want to leave, but where are they going to go? To Uzbekistan, to Tajikistan, you know, to Denmark, to France. Fat chance. So what'll happen now? Well, the most hopeful part is that China, which has a real stake in Afghanistan, they don't want Afghanistan to be a base for Islamic terrorists. They'll be the victims. Western China, Xinjiang, that'll be the victims if Turkic, Uyghur, other terrorist forces have a haven in Afghanistan. So we'd be pretty confident that they'll be trying to help the society develop in some fashion. They'll probably try to bring it into the China-based Eurasian, Central Asian system that they're creating with Russian support, with by now Iranian support, the whole complex system that grew out of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, now the Belt and Road Initiative. So they'll probably try to bring Afghanistan into that, maybe with some development aid, it's possible. And they'll certainly be desperately trying to keep any terrorist groups from forming there. US could cooperate on that. That would, of course, mean cooperating with China. That's not permitted. The yellow peril is supposed to be the big enemy. So we have to make sure not to cooperate with China, even though US-China cooperation is the basis for survival of the human species. If China and the United States do not cooperate on the major issues, like environmental destruction, pandemics, nuclear war, if we don't cooperate on that, we're done. Human species is finished. It's as simple as that. But it's not what's happening. We have to be more provocative. We have to show our muscle. New military forces, move the war to space, send an armada into the South China Sea, show who we are, you know. It's in the bones, you know. It's none of it surprising. If the British were still running the world, they'd be doing the same thing, just as they did when they were running the world. It's the nature of imperial power. It's not that, I mean, China does plenty of horrible things, but that's not a reason not to cooperate, any more than the fact that the US does horrible things is a reason for China not to cooperate. We have to. And Afghanistan's a perfect place. We have the same interests, making sure that some development takes place, that these hundreds of thousands of people who probably can't leave have something there that they can use to build and develop of some kind of life. We can help with that to some extent, not by drone attacks, but by development projects, real ones, not the kinds you do when you occupy a country, run by the people in the country themselves, their leadership. That'll include the Taliban, of course. In fact, they're the major force. May include what's left of the warlord system. We don't know exactly. Probably they'll be arising again. They already are in the Panjshir Valley in the north. So whatever works out in Afghanistan should be working with it. Try to help them from outside, not from on top, jointly with China, maybe Russia. Russia has a major interest there. Afghanistan is far from the United States, but it's on the border of the Russian Federation. Russia has every reason not to want radical Islam to develop in Afghanistan and influence the states to the north, which are had been within the Russian sphere. Every reason not to do that. So there happen to be shared interests. Maybe that's enough to get, I wouldn't expect leadership elements to do it on their own. That's not their nature. But popular forces could organize internationally solidarity to pressure their governments to act in a humane and sane fashion for once. It would be a break in human history, but it could happen.
What are some of the key points that perhaps can be considered to help Afghanistan become a success story, to help Afghanistan or Afghans go back to their country? Because many, like anyone that I have spoken to, says, I don't want to leave. I want to be in my own country. I want to help build my country. But they don't feel that they can under the current circumstances. What can be done, whether it's the US or the neighbors, to help Afghans?
First thing that could be done is willingness to absorb properly the people who want to flee and are able to flee. Don't close the doors to them, as Europe and the United States are now doing. So first thing to do is look into the mirror, see who we are, recognize that we have a responsibility to accept the people who are able to escape. One. Second, work jointly with others, with China, with Russia, with Tajikistan, with Middle Eastern countries, to try to help Afghanistan recover in some fashion in the way that Afghans will determine, not that we will determine. We've demonstrated for centuries how we determine things, leaving the world a smashed up wreck. So let them do it. They'll make mistakes. They'll do the wrong thing. Okay, we'll try to help. First, simple things we can do are release funds. They need the funds for reconstruction. Then jointly, probably mainly with China and Russia, work on some kind of support for internal development programs. It's a shared interest. All the imperial powers have the interest in seeing Afghanistan recover somehow and not fall apart and become a base for the Islamic State, which is just relishing everything that's happening. They love the drone attack after just what they wanted, and it had exactly the effect they wanted. Okay, so we can continue to support them as we've been supporting Al-Qaeda for 20 years, doing exactly what they want. Or we can turn to a different course, undermine them by supporting the societies where they are trying to establish roots relying on our brutality and violence. Okay. It's not a deep secret. It's right in front of our eyes. We've been watching it for 20 years.
Noam Chomsky, thank you for your time.